Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Mertha, and I'm the George and Sadie Hyman Professor of China Studies and the Director of the SAIS China Global Research Center at Johns Hopkins SAIS. I'd like to first of all thank all the people who made today's event possible. These include Ellie Rostom, Amanda Nepomnicino, Hasta Coleman, Mo Alahi, Michaela Tucker, Jessica Moreno, and particularly Lucy Seaver. Thank you to all of you. I'm privileged to share the virtual days with Dr. Fiona Hill. Dr. Hill is Senior Fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. She served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs on the National Security Council from 2017 to 2019. From 2006 to 2009, she served as National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. She is co-author of Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin, Brookings Institution Press 2015. Prior to joining Brookings, Dr. Hill was Director of Strategic Planning at the Eurasia Foundation in Washington, D.C. from 1991 to 1999. She held a number of positions during that time, directing technical assistance and research projects at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, including Associate Director of the Strengthening Democratic Institutions Project, Director of the Project on Ethnic Conflict in the former Soviet Union, and coordinator of the Trilateral Study on Japanese-Russian-US relations. Dr. Hill has researched and published extensively on issues related to Russia, the Caucasus, Central Asia, regional conflicts, energy, and strategic issues. Her book with Brookings Senior Fellow Clifford Gaddy, The Siberian Curse, How Communist Planners Left Russia Out in the Cold, was published by Brookings Institution Press in December of 2003. And her monograph, Energy Empire, Oil, Gas, and Russia's Revival, was published by the London Foreign Policy Center in 2004. The first edition of Mr. Putin was published by Brookings Institution Press in 2013, also with Clifford Gaddy. Most recently, she's the author of There's Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century, HarperCollins 2021. She holds a master's in Soviet Studies and a doctorate in history from Harvard University, where she was a Frank Knox Fellow. She also holds a master's in Russian and modern history from St. Andrews University in Scotland, and has pursued studies at Moscow's Maurice Thorez Institute of Foreign Languages. Dr. Hill is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. The timing for this event could not be more, or rather less, auspicious. Since having to reschedule this event from last month, we have seen Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with the West and a number of non-regional allies and partners rapidly and substantively increasing their support to beleaguered Ukraine, fundamentally rethinking their positioning in the post-Cold War era, while also seeing a potential deepening of Russia-China ties, or at the very least, a low-key but nonetheless furious attempt by Beijing behind the scenes to seek a diplomatic solution while seeking to prevent damaging its carefully crafted relationship with Moscow. In other words, the world has undergone a dramatic shift in the last week that lays bare many global tensions that simmered just under the surface for years, and has brought into full relief the full complexity of security concerns ranging from transatlantic alliance to the Russia-China partnership to all points in between and beyond. In such moments of uncertainty and increased tension that compel us to listen to and rely upon hard-earned expertise and wisdom, Dr. Hill possesses both in spades, as well as a reservoir of generosity and humanity that is as rare as it is vital to the community of scholars, policymakers, and fellow travelers. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. This will take the form of a conversation rather than with a formal presentation. We will begin with Dr. Hill's recently published memoir, There's Nothing for You Here. We will then ease into a conversation on the currently unfolding situation in Ukraine, and follow that with the original topic for discussion, that of Russia-China relations, but now seen in light of recent events. Please do send us your questions via the Zoom Q&A link, and I will fold them into the conversation. Because of the unusually but unsurprisingly large attendance today, I ask that you make your questions brief and to the point so that we can get to as many of them as possible. Fiona, if I may, thank you so very much for making the time to join us today. We couldn't be more grateful.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. It's really great to be here. And as you said, we actually rescheduled this several times. And, when we did, we would never have envisaged the environment in which we're speaking. So things have really changed quite dramatically in a matter of days, let alone in the weeks and months since we first talked about having this conversation together.
And I definitely want to get to all of that, but let me just set some, just some not parameters, but kind of start at the beginning, if you will, and kind of go to some of the the key themes in your book, which I think really should be required reading for everybody here and for many others beyond. So in the book, you write about your hard scrabble, that's my word, upbringing in the northeastern part of England at length. And then you extend this in a comparative way to what was happening in the Soviet Union during your year abroad in 1987, 1988. And then you do so further in your observations of the kind of class-based differences and balkanization in Boston and elsewhere in the United States. Did you draw those comparisons in real time? And how much of those are kind of from the benefit of retrospect or hindsight? And perhaps relatedly, when did you suspect that this was a global phenomenon, poised to challenge the seemingly kind of broad-based support for globalization that was the rage at the time?
Well, I'm glad you put that in this way, Andrew, and for all the participants that we've got on here, we had initially envisaged this as a kind of a book talk, and then it morphed into something else, and now we're just trying to put all these things together. But as this is, mostly SAIS students and, a whole group of other participants, I just want to flag that the way that I was able to figure all of this out was because of the benefits of great education. And, there's an awful lot to be said about using your own experience, but also being able to put things in a much larger frame, which really comes from having an opportunity to study both at the undergraduate and the graduate level. And I made comparisons that you laid out there in real time because I was trying to understand for myself the place that I came from, because I was growing up in a period of unbelievably rapid change, which everyone today is experiencing again here. I mean, we're getting whiplash from the quick pace of events. We've gone from a global pandemic, which we're still in the middle of, to now a really significant, serious war in Europe that has escalatory potential much broader, and that, as we're going to talk about later, has brought China into European affairs, into a way we wouldn't have thought about, but that's kind of getting a bit ahead of ourselves. But that's all happened in a matter of weeks. And when I was growing up in the northeast of England, I'm one in a very long, family generation of people who've grown up in the shadow of coal mining. I'm the first person in my family for generations not to go in the coal mines. Now, first of all, as a woman, that would have been unexpected. But even if I'd been, a boy, I wouldn't have been able to follow my father and uncles and grandfather and great uncles and great grandfather, et cetera, down the mines, because they were starting to close. So I basically was born at the whole time of economic dislocation, of the emergence of globalization, where economic patterns were shifting dramatically and having often social and cultural outcomes. And when I mean cultural outcomes, I mean that, somebody like my father and all of my family, their whole identities and the kind of the microculture that was built up around this, of all of their pastimes, all of the things that, people talked about, was all built around coal mining and the villages and towns that this took place in, all the associated heavy industries of steel making, shipbuilding, railways, freight railways, and again, everything in the area in which I grew up in the northeast of England was dominated by heavy industry. And another point that took me a while, I think, to fully process, which is again how I start to see these larger patterns when I started to try to understand it, was all of this industry in the United Kingdom was nationalised, which was a factor of World War II. most of the coal mines and steelworks and shipyards had been privately owned until World War II. And then and this is why it's important for today, because we're going to have a massive dislocation, not just from the war in Ukraine, but all of the sanctions that have been put on Russia on top of all of the supply lines that have already been ruptured by COVID. Basically, the fact that the United Kingdom had been isolated from the global economy for the full 4 or 5 years of the war meant that there'd been huge economic losses, and private owners could not rebuild their industry. So it was very different from the United States that had been, after World War II, somewhat separated from the centres of the conflict. And the private sector was able to move from wartime production to kind of mass manufacturing again, particularly in the auto industries, and it was like Detroit and elsewhere. But in the UK, British industry was pretty much in a state of collapse, not leveled like it was in Europe, where the Marshall Plan had to help with a massive rebuilding, but just that the state was pretty much bankrupt. And after World War II, there was a process of nationalising industry to try to build it back up again, but also creating these new entities like the welfare state and the National Health Service to try to get people back on their footing again. So I come from an area that's dominated by heavy industry, that's nationalised, and with the National Health Service and all these other attributes to turn, the economy around and build things up again from World War II. And when I get to the Soviet Union the first time, because it was still the Soviet Union in 1987, I, of course, see a country on a massive scale of nationalised industry, with everything being run by the state sector. And it's in a state of collapse. And I start to understand that some of the same things that I'm seeing in the Soviet Union as at home, empty shops, crumbling infrastructure. Yes, they're the same, but they've got far different reasons. Because in the Soviet Union, this is the fault of central planning that's run out of steam. There was no central planning, even if there was nationalised industry in the north of England. I mean, the rest of Britain is largely outside of these heavy industrial sectors, still capitalist and market-based and entrepreneurial. But in when I was growing up, nobody had any demand because nobody had any money. And so, the shops were empty because they all were getting closed down because people couldn't afford to buy anything. And of course, in the Soviet Union, it was the opposite. People had lots of pent-up consumer demand, but there was no supply because the Soviet system wasn't kind of keeping up with the demand and, couldn't obviously respond to shifts. And then when I came to the United States in 1989, obviously here's a country that is just full-blown market capitalism, but also is now experiencing in that period the stresses and strains of globalization as the economy changes, as also heavy industry becomes more automated and is modernized, and there's decreasing demand for manual labor. And when I got to Boston, all of the factories were starting to close down, the heavy manufacturing. And Boston at that point was kind of coming out of a really difficult period in 1989, the 1970s, 1980s, of seeing industrial decline. And I started to see, okay, same pattern, but obviously very different reasons, and trying to understand that. And so what I did was I enrolled myself in as many courses as I possibly could to try to figure out, what was happening in the real time, which gets us back to, SAIS and all the things that people are studying. My own personal observations that I didn't fully understand the dynamics, I was able to then translate them onto a bigger scale by, being able to have the great good fortune of studying with academics like yourself, who are basically explaining all of these things in real time. And I just wanted to just leave with one little vignette for, how we are today. My most vivid memory of my first semester at Harvard is in October of 1989, where I'd enrolled in a class on the origins of the Cold War. And we were about to have a lecture on, the Berlin crisis. And we were kind of sitting, waiting. The professor, Stanley Hoffman, the famous, government studies IR theorist, is late. He's supposed to be teaching the class. He comes in really late, and he swishes around. He used to wear this strange cape, made of like pressed felt, one of these Loden, Austrian capes, and a hat. And it wasn't that cold, but he whipped his cape off and his hat with dramatic flair, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Berlin Wall has fallen." And we all just sat in shock, because we were actually going to be just studying how the Berlin Wall came up in the first place. And here we were in real time, the beginning and the end of a whole phenomenon, all, kind of happening against, the backdrop of reality, but trying to sort of explain it in the class. And so, one of the motivations for writing the book, one of many, was to try to kind of put together what I'd observed, but then what I'd learned, over time to try to sort of explain about how all of these different phenomena come together.
A bit of a spoiler alert that the wall did eventually come down kind of in real time.
Yes, exactly.
I remember that I was in Hungary just the year before that, reading Time magazine, which was available in Hungary. And I remember there was the cover story was, "Will Germany ever reunify?" And I just remember at the time thinking, of course not. I mean, things are set. It's the way, and once again, I couldn't have been more wrong. But
well, I had a similar thing that my sister was going to go with a group of friends to Berlin that summer, and in August, when of course there's when the Hungarians are starting to go out and kind of basically go on tourist trips that then became them not coming back. It's the beginning of the end. And because I was getting ready to go to Harvard, when my sister asked me to come along, I said, no, I can't. I didn't have enough money to do that. They were going on a bus and all kinds of different things. And I said, Berlin's not going anywhere. It'll maybe when I next summer I can go. Well, of course, Berlin didn't go anywhere, but a lot of things happened in Berlin, and the wall certainly went somewhere. So that was really famous last words, right?
Yeah, well, at least I'm in good company there. I'm going to switch to another theme in the book, because it is a memoir, but it is so deeply embedded in these larger questions that you were very much a part of, and that shaped you when you weren't shaping them yourself. And with the audience of students in mind, you devote much in the book on looking at how women and minorities continue to face an uphill climb when it comes to career opportunities and to have their voices heard in the professional workplace, in the policy world. How can they, or how can all of us, better navigate the dynamics between principle and the imperatives of the job?
Well, yeah, that's really is a very good question. I've always focused as best I absolutely can on making sure I know my stuff, right? So if there's things that I don't know about, I will always try to say, so that I don't get myself out on a limb, way beyond where my expertise is. But also then, trying to sort of learn as much as I possibly can about a subject, so that, what I'm saying is based on, some authority and, some real deep knowledge, rather than just, winging it, based on opinion or interpretation of events. Because I always kind of really feel that, that's kind of, where, women and minorities, no one's going to look to you automatically for, an opinion or, some advice or any kind of analysis on things as a normal matter of course, at least, not initially. And you've got to prove yourself over time. And, I've now got a platform that I never would have thought that I would have had at the beginnings of my career, but I'm also not that young. I'm 56 now. So it's taken an awfully long time to build up that, kind of, let's just sort of say, substantive knowledge-based capital, the assets. And, often, when people who are not women and not minorities, no matter how we describe this, often get a pass much earlier on in their careers, to be able to sort of step forward and opine or, offer analysis and advice. So it does sometimes, take quite a long time to overcome the barriers. That's another reason for writing the book, because in laying, some of this out in the book about how difficult it was for a woman from a very underprivileged, low socioeconomic background, really a kind of fairly peripheral area of the UK, to make it to where I have, I benefited a great deal from other people assisting, for opportunities that people offered, for assistance and advice along the way in overcoming various barriers. And I wanted to lay that out in the book so that people can think about all the barriers that are put in front of people, so that people don't have an unfair disadvantage. Everybody has a hard time, making their way, no matter, how privileged you are. There was always some kind of difficulty there. But an awful lot of students at SAIS and elsewhere have got multiple sources of disadvantage, either in their background, their family life, where they're from, in a regional basis as well. It's a lot more easy to get access to opportunities in an urban area that's pretty prosperous than in a rural area that's hit hard times, and you've got miles, from anywhere. Even with now new communications, just the difficulties of getting from A to B, for example. So I wanted people to be able to think about that, about all of the barriers that are imposed on people for entry, and to think about how we can collectively overcome them. And institutions like SAIS and Johns Hopkins overall can play a very important role of, thinking about people who are first generation to go to university from underserved regions. I think an awful lot has been done over time on all manner of diversity, gender, ethnic, racial, but often not on a geographic, sort of spatial inequality, or, I would say, if you think about where everyone comes from after a certain particular point, we do see a sort of a preponderance of people from not just elite institutions, but also from, let's just say, elite geographies. Your zip code counts an awful lot in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and look, everywhere else as well. Very difficult to make it from a remote village rather than from a capital city. So just trying to sort of think in different ways about how we can create opportunity for people who wouldn't necessarily get access is pretty critical.
So I grew up in New York City, and I deliberately went to a big state school with a big football team to have a completely different experience. This is back in 1983 when Detroit was really getting hit. And I just remember realizing at the time just how provincial my upbringing in cosmopolitan Manhattan could be. So I think that shares kind of the flip side of that. I would just slightly push back on one thing that you said, which is that you're not that young. We were both born in 1965, and
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I take exception to that.
It's all relative, right? It's relative. But relative to some of the attendees, let's say, for whom we must probably seem ancient.
Fair enough. I feel that way every time I walk into a classroom. Let me ask a bit more of a challenging question. It's challenging to me when I'm asked it, and I just would love to get your thoughts on it, even if they're kind of just initial thoughts. There will inevitably be some who are able to overcome the odds that life has presented them, and even a few of those who rise to the levels that, well, for example, you have. And they can identify with your story and share their achievements with yours. What do we say to those who, through no fault of their own, fail to break through the formidable challenges that they confront and that you write about so eloquently?
Well, look, I think we have to find ways of bringing, everybody into, I call in the book, the infrastructure of opportunity. So look, it behooves those of us like you and me to start to kind of think, and this book, recently was a challenge to myself as well, to start to think about, different ways. At the back of the book, there's all kinds of things that we could do as individuals or in groups to try to break through those barriers so that more people can be able to take advantage of educational or job or other possibilities. Thinking about education, continuous education, vocational training, sort of skills-based approach to things, everything in a different way. I would also, basically say that nothing happens without collective action, even though we have independent agency. And I think it's very interesting to see now, when we've had a bit of a breakdown in our representative democracy, where we've basically been having members of our political parties saying that they only represent the people who voted for them, or people in their particular, red or blue tribe, that this is, extraordinarily problematic when we think about trying to sort of affect some kind of social change and breaking down barriers. But we're seeing a kind of a push for different forms of representation at different levels. Baristas in Starbucks, for example, research assistants at places like Brookings. I mean, obviously a bit of a different category there. But, people in fast food, McDonald's and, elsewhere, factory floors, all trying to look for, some way of having some collective representation, having their voice heard. So not the old massive trade unions of the past, but smaller, more flexible collectives where people can give mutual support, as well as kind of find ways of improving their situation. And growing up in the area that I did, I described this in the book. My great-grandfather was one of the spokesmen for the Durham Miners Association, which was, set up towards the end of the 19th century, not just to get better conditions down the mines where, small children and women and, many others were basically down in the mines on a regular basis, improving working conditions and safety, for example. But it was also a way of miners pooling their resources for opportunity. And they set up a whole set of societies called welfare societies. And it's not welfare as we've started to think about it now in terms of people living off, handouts from the state. It's welfare as it was originally in the preamble to the US Constitution, which is a sense of well-being, of kind of mutual assistance and of community for the general welfare, the well-being of, the broader group. And they set up everything from reading and literary societies to things like greyhound racing and keeping pigeons, pigeon racing, and allotments, garden plots, and soccer teams and sketching clubs. And some of these became very prominent. And in fact, there was a whole period in the United Kingdom where football was dominated by teams that were essentially formed by miners and their families. And there was also educational opportunities. I got one of my first grants to study Russian, which was after high school, but just as I was wanting to go to enter university, from the Durham Miners Association. And one of the weird elements of that, which I've mentioned on a couple of occasions, is some of that money came from money that was raised by miners globally in support of the miners of the United Kingdom during the big miners' strike of 1984, 1985. And the money that came to me came from the miners of Donbass, right, of course, in the middle of what's been happening in Ukraine, because that was one of the biggest Soviet era then coal fields, and along with the Kuzbass in Siberia. So my initial forays into the Russian language for an intensive Russian language course were paid in part by money that was collected by the Durham miners and supplemented by some miners of the Donbass funding. But it's that whole idea of how people can group together to give a larger set of people the same opportunities that individuals might have by mutual association and people thinking of a broader welfare. And, groups do it, students' unions do it. There's all kinds of different ways in which we can tackle that very problem where not everyone has the same access or the same advantages as others.
That's really something that it's really important, and it's one of those things that seems to not be part of some of the more kind of dominant or frequent conversations, but it is something that clearly meets with results, and in unexpected ways, but in a good sense. Let me ask one more student SAIS related question before we move on to Ukraine. And this is pretty much an open-ended question. What is your message to students of international relations? Or specifically, how should they look upon the formidable responsibilities they have in the world that is unfolding in front of our very eyes? And what are some of the things that they should be aware of that might not be part of a formal curriculum?
Yeah, I mean, look, one thing is, given the SAIS student body, what a remarkable opportunity you have to learn from others, from your peers, because it's not everything that's in books or in the lectures, with all due respect to Professor Mertha and all of his colleagues. But it's that opportunity to kind of understand, real life from people. I mean, I just love the fact that SAIS has all of these campuses internationally. I mean, I'm sure some of this is going to get horribly affected by the events that are unfolding right now. And I know COVID has also put, some real constraints on those opportunities to going to go study somewhere else. But for me, from the earliest stages of my education, school exchanges, for example, are pretty vital. I got to be an exchange student in Tübingen in Germany. I described that in the book when I was 13. I had other exchanges to France in, kind of the course of just being in, regular middle and high school. I got the opportunity to study abroad in Russia from 1987 to 1988, and of course work there and do much more work after that time. But that period of real life experience of 87, 88 was what made everything. And it's sort of in a way that reading is supplemental to real life. Theory, kind of falls apart often when it hits practice, but it's a really good frame for understanding things. But I also do really share what you just said about a responsibility. I've always looked at education obviously is a privilege, because I feel very privileged to have been able to have one, given my family's history, but also then as a responsibility to be able to apply it, to try to explain to people, to help other people understand the things that you've realized as well. And part of that is in regular exchange, regular discussions, student groups, to just your friends, to basically discuss developments. And remember, we're all living in history. Everything that's happening is in kind of real time. We're constantly interpreting things. And as you said, Andrew, that when you get to a few years on, things will look quite different. I mean, there's a lot of hindsight in my book, but there's also a lot of real-time understanding of what was happening because of talking to the people around me, trying to read as much as possible, really kind of understand what's happening. And also, going out there and sort of proselytizing in favor of international relations, because so many universities are cutting back on IR, on humanities, language study. I was just at Harvard to find that almost nobody's teaching any courses on Russian history anymore at Harvard. I mean, that just makes no sense. And, the kind of Russian studies, Russian language studies has dropped off, for example, because of course trends shift things. People went into Arabic and then they went into Chinese, but, European studies, at one point there was a real drop. And I imagine that there'll be a big burst again of people, studying Europe and European security issues. SAIS has really kind of kept the flag flying here. But I'm trying to sort of fan out to world affairs councils and universities across the country right now, obviously to get the word out, which I hope you will do too, and think about doing these to other student groups in conferences and other fora, that it's vital that people across the entire country understand world affairs and how we all fit into it, because they will have an impact on us. I mean, look, even if you're in a farm in Iowa, and especially if you're in a farm in Iowa right now, all of these global commodity shifts with, the breadbasket of the former Russian Empire, Odessa being, and Ukraine, Odessa being the port that, brought all the grain out, still one of the largest grain ports in the entire world. It was the fastest growing city in 1900 in Europe. And it is now under siege by, the Russian military. The biggest producers of grain, with the exception of Canada and the United States, are Russia, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. And here we are with a war right in the middle of, again, some of the most fertile areas of the world that other places are dependent upon. And will farmers in Iowa and elsewhere, given climate shifts and everything else, be able to step up? Or why are we going to be facing the inevitability of massive food shortages, especially in places like Lebanon and Yemen and many others that have been through the World Food Programs, dependent on all of these grain transfers. So even things that you haven't really initially thought of become massively affected by world events. And it's people like you at SAIS who are going to be able to put all of these things together to alert people and then to be able to explain what's happening and come up with ideas of what we can actually do about it.
I couldn't agree with you more about this unfortunate trend. I mean, things like area studies and applied seem to be four-letter words, within the disciplines. And I think what you're doing is something that's really, really important and should be emulated. And I'll take my marching orders from what you just said and continue doing, what I'm doing and deepening that. Of course, that's something that is central to what SAIS does, which is one of the reasons I was attracted, to come here. So on that note, let's switch switch gears a little bit and talk about what's going on in Ukraine right now. We're already getting a lot of terrific questions, and so what I'm going to be doing in real time is asking, listening, and putting together questions that we get there. But let me start broadly and kind of work our way in. And there are a number of narratives that have emerged in the lead up and in the weeks since Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And I'm just going to list four of them. Which of the following ones, as well as any that I did not mention, are more or less likely to be behind the decision to invade, based on what we know now? The first one is humiliation following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Second narrative is kind of co-joined nationalism between Russia and Ukraine. Third would be NATO expansion up to the Russian border, that's to say external security. And then a fourth, ditto, meaning NATO expansion up to the Russian border, but in terms of internal security and the threat of democratization. And then, of course, any others that I've left out. How much do each of those, in turn, in your mind, seem to have been behind this, the events that we're seeing unfolding right now?
Well, these all blend together, as is kind of fairly obvious, and there probably is, a certain ranking. I mean, it's very clear that NATO is a major security preoccupation for Putin and for Russia at large. There was a shift in the way that Russians thought about NATO in 1999 when Belgrade was bombed by essentially NATO forces and the leadership of the United States in response to all of the massacres of Kosovo Albanians by the Serbs, the belated intervention of the United States into the Balkan Wars, the wars of the Yugoslav succession. I mean, clearly NATO was seen by Putin and people around him, from that vintage, that Soviet vintage, as the enemy, the main opponent of the Warsaw Pact. There was a hope on many parts in the 1990s, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, that there'd be a new relationship between NATO and Russia, and there was the NATO-Russia Founding Act that then created the NATO-Russia Council in 1997. But as I said, 1999 flips the switch in Russia from, okay, we're not really sure what to make of NATO. Maybe this is true that it's going in a different direction. We had the Partnership for Peace, where Russia and other countries that had been the former Soviet bloc, former Warsaw Pact countries were having a kind of a NATO-light relationship. There's, of course, all of those big debates about whether there were promises not to expand NATO, and if everyone wants to read as much as you possibly can about that, I would recommend Mary-Elise Sarotti's book Not 1 Inch, which goes into great detail into all the back and forth in the 1990s, from 1990 onwards, in the reunification of Germany. Getting back to the point you made there, Andrew, about reunification of Germany and what all of that would mean, and clearly all kinds of miscommunications, misperceptions, sort of promises, half promises, and then the force of events taking over, where Eastern European countries like Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary want to join NATO because they worry about how Russia will shift, and those are the three countries, the first who want to join, who of course had faced incursions by interventions by Moscow and the Soviet army. Variously, 1956 in Hungary, 1968 in Czechoslovakia, and of course more recently at that point in the late 1980s in Poland. And so, those three countries don't believe that Russia sort of disappeared. They want to join, and that all then kind of coincides with their push to join with the NATO operation that ends in bombing Belgrade. And Vladimir Putin at that point is the head of the FSB, the successor to the KGB, and he sees this and sees that NATO then is still a military alliance. And from that kind of point onwards, it's obviously preying upon his mind how to stop NATO from moving further. He puts everybody on notice in 2007 at Munich, the Munich Security Conference, because after that point, 2004, we have another expansive entry into NATO and also into the European Union, including the Baltic states. And basically Putin saying no more, no more. And then 2008, the Bucharest summit. I mean, everybody's been following all of this and the discussion about it. There's that open door made to Ukraine and Georgia. And from that point on, I think we've been hurtling towards something just like this, where Putin wanted to make sure that door was closed. And I've mentioned before that I think that was really the pivotal point and something of a strategic blunder, because it wasn't a good idea to put on the table a membership action plan for Georgia and Ukraine when there was so much opposition to it, including at that point in Ukraine as well, where there wasn't a great deal of enthusiasm. So it shouldn't have been tabled, and there should have been other thinking going on. And plus, we should have been alert from 1999 onwards to figuring out how to mitigate this antipathy from Putin and people like him, maybe because, of course, he goes on to become president, and how we were going to sort of deal with a Russia that was always going to be thinking of NATO expansion as a massive threat. So how are you going to handle this with the different ways of doing this? We should have been thinking about that, not just, kind of fairly recently, but, since 1999, for the whole point of the 2000s, as we went through our various periods of expansion. So it's basically like taking out insurance in a flood zone, where it's flipped from, the 100-year floods and the 50-year floods to the 10-year floods, the every-year floods, but not putting yourself on stilts, getting sandbags and having a plan, or basically thinking about, even moving, further inland kind of thing. Now, all of those other issues that you talk about all blend into that, because, with the idea of Ukraine and NATO, as well as Georgia and other former Soviet republics, you've got in this, as you said, co-joined nationalism on the part of Putin and many other people like him who believe that Ukraine and Russia are inextricably tied together, or as he's put it lately, one people, one nation, which then he's committing suicide if he's leveling it. But anyway, there have been a whole host of other, nationalists, including the mayor Yuri Lushkov of Moscow back in the early 1990s, members of various, other political parties who've been pressing, for Ukraine to, certainly Crimea, but, other parts of Ukraine to be pulled back toward Russia, short of annexation, certainly bringing Ukraine back into Russia's orbit, similar to the desire to bring Belarus and Russia into a single union. So that's always been part of this. And NATO then, and the whole NATO idea amplifies the anxiety about that. Humiliation is part of that, because why is it that NATO expanded? It's because the Soviet Union fell apart. Of course, it's Boris Yeltsin who pulled it apart with the then president of Ukraine and Belarus in, a hunting lodge in Belarus as part of a power play with Gorbachev, not thinking about the consequences then that everything would not just unravel, but, really pull apart in quite a dangerous way. But it's Putin who at that point is in Dresden. And as he said this before, seeing that the Soviet Union disappears and that there's no answer then to all of the kind of the disarray and the chaos. And he feels himself personally humiliated by Russia's loss of place. And he's talked about, the humiliations of state collapse, not just the Soviet Union, but more recently about the collapse of the Russian Empire, and blaming Lenin and the communists and all the Bolsheviks for all kinds of other things that have led to the situation where we are today. He's been delving back into history. And then there is the point finally of that internal fear of democracy, because what Ukraine was doing was moving away from Russia, showing that one could have a very different country. I mean, Ukraine is often confounding for people, looking at it from the outside, as well as them living inside, because it's horizontal and networked. It doesn't have a vertical of power in the way that Russia does. And of course, that's been deeply frustrating for the Russians historically. It was run by Cossack hetmanates. It was, the different empires, Polish, Lithuanian, Swedish, Ottoman, all over the place. Many of Ukrainians were those who just sort of escaped the Tsarist, efforts to impose serfdom. Cossacks were, of course, the freemen, the freebooters, the privateers, and kind of everybody's imagination and real life in history. Runaway peasants, kind of Ukraine was always that kind of the borderlands where anything goes and people feel free, but of course everyone comes in and takes a bit and kind of moves on as well. And Ukraine was kind of living to type, basically quite a very vibrant society, difficult to kind of impose control on. Putin obviously didn't understand it, but he knew that he didn't want to have that at home. And stopping Ukraine then from as messy as it might be, heading, as in he thought, west to NATO, to the European Union, but just basically being free and unfettered and showing a different model was too much. And I mean, now, we see that Putin's trying to destroy that, to extinguish it, and to essentially wipe Ukraine off the map. And it's conjuring up, kind of all the sort of images at home in Russia now of, return to an earlier era of massive repression, because Putin can't afford to see the sort of dissent and the protest and the upswelling of can-do spirit that we've seen in Ukraine, even in the midst of the war. And so he's clamping down at home now as well, to make sure that nobody gets any ideas from the spirit of Ukraine. I mean, obviously, there's a horrible signaling of what could happen through the war about this is what you get, if you kind of try to get outside of our orbit. But people are getting information about how Ukrainians are organizing and pushing back against all of this, because he doesn't want the same thing to happen at home.
That's it reminds me a little bit of when you talked about the discussions between Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, and the specter of unanticipated consequences or unforeseen outcomes, it's a little like the 1974 Constitution in Yugoslavia, which essentially kind of presaged the events 20 years hence. Which actually brings me to another question that I had, which is the role of analogies. Now, understanding that people use analogies all the time, and they use them wrong almost all the time, and yet they're one of the few tools that we have at our disposal to make sense of complex events unfolding in real time. Which analogies have you heard invoked that seem to be problematic, and which ones would you might you want to point policymakers, scholars, and just people with an interest in all of this to maybe give a bit of a tentative roadmap?
Yeah, I mean, that's really very good question. And I'm probably, one of the people who's guilty of making all kinds of analogies, myself as well, because, I mean, what is an analogy? It's really sort of a reference point, right? I mean, you're not saying this is, you're saying this is analogous to this, but it's not similar, but it's not the same. And it's really kind of a point of references to try to kind of orient ourselves around an issue, to try to kind of like figure out what might happen or what are the various things that we should think about. So, I mean, there are various analogies that are being blown, kind of up right now, literally, and bandied around about what's happening in the sieges of all of the Ukrainian cities. References or analogies made to Aleppo, where, of course, after the Russians intervened in Syria, they helped Assad pretty much level his own country to push back not just the ISIS and, the caliphate, but also his own opposition to keep him in power. Now, in this case, of course, Putin is leveling, Ukraine, not at the behest of anybody in Ukraine, but, basically to teach Ukrainians a lesson. And that kind of then might become analogous to the situation in Chechnya, which, of course, is different because this was in Russia's own territory. But the largest military operation in Europe after World War II was first in Chechnya before being in Ukraine, where, and there's some analogies here to the Chechens, of course, secede. They want to move away from Russia. It's initially an ethno-political conflict. The Islamicization that sort of comes in later is really a consequence of the brutality of the Russian action, because it starts to draw fighters in from the outside, which is starting to happen also in Ukraine. But the first leaders of what they wanted to be an independent Chechnya, including Dzhokhar Dudayev, I mean, he was more of a Soviet, military person who, really had a very loose affiliation with Islam. He'd been the commander of basically a base in Tartu in Estonia. And, his wife was, I think, Estonian and Russian, but this is not, kind of, someone who anyone would think of as an Islamist. And there was one point where he made some oath on the Quran at some point. It was clear he didn't know what he was doing. He did it incorrectly. And, he was doing this, to try to kind of rally the masses at one point, but people were always criticizing him and, making a point that, he wasn't very Chechen. And it certainly wasn't a sort of a national, a movement at first. It was more of, what we see in Ukraine, of a desire to sort of live differently. And as the other countries, former Soviet republics had seceded, Chechnya thought it had the right to as well on the basis of the Soviet constitution. There was lots of kind of thinking about this, but of course that wasn't going to happen from the Russian perspective, part of the Russian Federation. And initially there was an intervention by special forces to try to, topple Dudayev and impose someone else from, more to Russia's choosing. It sounds familiar, right? And then that quickly gets out of hand. The special forces are basically they're interdicted, they're captured by the Chechens who parade them on television. And the next thing, Boris Yeltsin has a meeting with his military commanders, and Pavel Gorbachev, who was the head of the military at the time, says something to the likes of, well, I'll just go in and out and sort this out and you'll never even know I was there. Fast forward, multiple grinding rounds of war, the leveling of Grozny. And we end up now with the most bizarre situation imaginable of a perverse version of a mini Islamic state run by a Chechen strongman, Ramzan Kadyrov, in Chechnya, and the rest is a horrible, horrible history, and the outcome is perverse. And what we also saw in the case of Chechnya was that the Russian government did not want to compromise. They wanted to level Chechnya, subjugate it, even though most of the casualties were Russians, including Russian soldiers and ethnic Russian speakers who lived in Grozny, the capital city, which was very much Russified, but also identified themselves with the place where they lived, by the way, and felt really quite distant as well as abandoned and then tormented by the military operation. But Russia was adamant on putting its own person in, no matter how brutal or perverse the outcome might be. And I think that in some respects is a helpful reference point to think about what some of the goals might be in Ukraine, but of course it's not sufficient. And I mean, there are Chechen battalions being sent to fight there as well, but because Ukraine is a totally independent country that for 30 years has lived separately. And so there are other, kind of analogies that one might also look at in terms of networks, because you have Putin being very obsessed with putting his own guys in, and people coming out of different networks. People, can talk about sort of a mafia group that, basically Zelensky, runs with a different crew and wants to go in a different direction. Or there's kinds of business analogies as well. There is Mikhail Hodorkovsky, who took over Yukos, the major energy company, and thought that as this is the new Russia, as the CEO of an independent energy company, although this is sort of carved out of some of the state assets, he had the right not just to sell shares in it, but perhaps even to sell the whole company. And he then is, obviously, as we know, basically arrested by the Russian government, put in a penal colony for 10 or 11 years. And, Zelensky, looks a lot like Mikhail Hodorkovsky, as somebody who thinks, well, look, 30 years, Ukraine's been independent. And, I want to, move it off into a different direction, associate with others. And Putin basically saying, no, you're not, Ukraine isn't independent. And, basically going after Zelensky as well. But all of these are just references to try to sort of understand. There's also historical analogies, with the expansion of the Russian Empire, the way that Russia conquered places in the past and put in their own leadership, or co-opted, the regional aristocracies, for example, and created their own princes that they kind of brought to the court. There are so many different things, but again, it's just a reference point. So I think we do have to be careful with analogies.
I completely agree and take your point. And I mean, to some degree, choosing the wrong analogy is almost inevitable, just given just how fast-moving things are and just the absence of information that we have. We have a lot of questions, so what I'm going to do is move to some of those and bunch them together, because I think they fit really nicely with the analogies that you drew upon just now. And I guess they have to do with countries.
Yeah, can I just ask you guys, just very quickly, can you hear background noise behind me? Because I have construction going on outside and I can hear some noise. And if you can hear it as well, if you could signal, I can put headphones on and a microphone, so then I can cut that out. You can't hear anything?
Can't hear anything. Okay. And
just let me know if you do, because I mean, for me, I can hear things, but I'm not sure what's being picked up on your end.
Sure, I'm not picking up anything. I'll
stand at the ready to, okay.
But I'll also, I'll ask IT to jump in if they hear something that I can't, because I think
okay, great,
their speakers are probably,
yeah, exactly.
Than mine. Yeah.
Yeah.
So a bunch of questions have to do with countries that are geographically adjacent to all of this that's going on. So Moldova being one, Finland's discussion about joining NATO, and others. So if I can just pull kind of one of these up. I mean, these situations are quite different, but with, as well as the notion of Ukraine possibly joining not NATO, but the EU at this point. Clearly, this is not something that seems to necessarily be likely to be contained within kind of the current theater of war, at least as far as not necessarily belligerence, but kind of diplomatic and other relationships evolved as a result of all this. What would you anticipate, knowing that things can change any moment, but Belarus, Moldova, the Baltic states, Finland, and even Sweden toying with the idea of moving away from neutrality?
Yeah, I mean, this is really a very important point. I mean, all of these questions here, I mean, this is why we said at the very beginning, things are changing in real time. Sweden and Finland always wanted to have that strategic ambiguity, the opportunity to join NATO, if necessary. It was part of their bargaining and leveraging in their relationship with Russia. Obviously, they've built their own independent defenses. They work very closely with military cooperation on a bilateral level, including with the United States, but with the other Scandinavian countries, with the Baltic states, and within the European Union, of course, the common security and defence policy, Sweden and Finland have been major contributors, but they always put, NATO, to one side. But now, of course, we're seeing more serious discussion from both countries because, like Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic in the past, they're worrying greatly about what the implications will be. The Baltic states, obviously, very clearly worrying, and Poland too. That now, as we see this conflict spreading, and Belarus is already part of Russia's security domain, even without the recent developments, but now we see it as being used as the platform and launching pad for the invasion into Ukraine. Poland and Lithuania, in particular, have a great deal to be concerned about because we have the exclave of Kaliningrad on the Baltic Sea, the old Königsberg, and we have this strip of territory in between what we call the Suwalki Gap, separating off from Belarus. And people have always been extraordinarily worried about that strip of land, whether Russia would demand a fixed corridor if Belarus and Russia are now one and the same. And, after this, there is the absorption of Belarus into Russia and the formalization of that Belarusian Union state, and it becomes more like an annexation of Belarus. What happens to that strip of territory? What happens to Poland and the Baltic states that now find themselves, very much caught up into this strategic standoff? So I think we're really going to be seeing a lot of close attention by NATO and elsewhere to this. And the EU, this request of Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine to have immediate entry, it was the EU association agreement that sparked off a lot of the developments that we're seeing now. Back in 2013, Euromaidan, the Russian annexation of Crimea, because the Russians told the Ukrainians and Armenians and others who were on the verge of signing an association agreement with the European Union that it was unacceptable because it was a backdoor to NATO. So they can't really change their mind about that. Because basically the common security and defence policy aspects of the EU agreements also involve close coordination with NATO, and the Russians were very explicit about this. And although, in the run-up to the war, the invasion, there was sort of signalling said, well, the EU is fine. I don't think anybody really believes that, because it was the EU that sparked off the last round of invasions of Ukraine. And yes, Ukraine now does have the association agreement that was kind of, concluded, and there's visa liberalization, etc. The full-blown entry into the EU would seem to be completely out of step with what Putin is looking for, because, they've made demands about the neutralization of Ukraine. It's not just wanting to have no membership of NATO in the Ukrainian constitution, because actually the Ukrainians changed that constitution. That was a big mistake as well, earlier on, in terms of provoking Russia, let's say. Of course, Ukraine and other countries have a perfect right to, seek entry, but, the way that the Russians were posing that, it wasn't originally in the Ukrainian constitution. Now, the Russians invaded anyway, but, the point is that the Russians have now made this as even more of a kind of a focal point and wanting to see that change, but they also want full neutrality, demilitarization, and that isn't at all the sort of situation with other European countries either. We had the recent very bizarre episode in where Lukashenko with Belarus has a map that he shows in a television interview in a press conference, which shows a dismembered Ukraine and Moldova as being, kind of a next target. That's obviously got everyone rather worried as well. So I just want to, say here that we're in a much broader sphere of problems. And we're going to have to be paying close attention. Now, the noise for me is actually becoming quite extreme. So if you want to move on to the next questions, I'm going to put my headphones on so that I can hear you better. And I'll just put myself on mute for a second. If you want to let me know what the next set of questions are.
Sure, that sounds fine. Okay, can you hear me okay? Can you hear me? You're muted.
Yeah, sorry, that was just getting very distracting on my end, so I'm sorry.
I was starting to hear that as well. I don't hear anything now, and I hear you fine. You hear me okay?
Yeah, I think it's coming and going. I think they've got some kind of, blower for dust and, other things that are going on out there.
The pleasures of water mains.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
So I didn't want to get to this one prematurely, but I think here we are. There has been discussion about the nuclear weapons and nuclear arsenal, but the way in which it's framed in this question, I think, is something that I think many people here, certainly myself, would like to hear your thoughts on this. So Putin is defining any number of actions from things like a no-fly zone, which actually does amount to a de facto act of war, to upgrading of sanctions as also being an act of war. The fact that we want to avoid a war with Russia being the primary calculus for non-intervention because of the fear of unleashing some sort of nuclear activity kind of muddies the water in a way that does not necessarily lend itself to strategic ambiguity. Can be a good thing. In this case, it seems like it could be a little bit more problematic. Would he be likely to risk some sort of demonstration as an act of quote unquote defense?
I mean, yes, sadly, I do think that there is a risk of that, which is why we actually have to have a full court diplomatic effort, behind the scenes on this. And, one of the reasons that I've mentioned it in other interviews is precisely because Putin has put that option on the table. And when he puts something on the table, it's not just there to be just sort of idly, hey, reminding you that I've got this, amazing arsenal that I can basically use. He's obviously trying to figure out in some way how we can use it for demonstration effect. So we just have to be very mindful about that, because there's obviously an escalatory ladder. He's already moved up the sort of preliminary stages. The next stage, well, maybe the couple of stages of various alerts, but might be some kind of battlefield nuclear weapon. And look, he's creating a whole host of, or trying to create a whole host of hysteria around this. So we have to be very careful about how we talk about it, and very careful about how we think about it, and careful about how we approach it. I think the administration's done absolutely the right thing about not responding in kind. And we've also heard Putin and others making absolutely spurious and ridiculous claims that Ukraine, obviously wanting to conjure up images of Iran or North Korea as seeking a nuclear weapon. And it may be that, they may then say that now, because this is just the kind of ridiculous things that, Russian propagandists and operatives do, now that they've seized control of the Chernobyl, exclusion zone and the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, they've found, secret weapons programs or something, hidden behind, civilian nuclear power, or behind, the efforts to, kind of maintain the integrity of, Chernobyl, the sarcophagus and the, waste removal, etc. I wouldn't put anything past them. Because we've heard, the most ridiculous claims in the past. But the whole idea meant to be that, Ukraine is irresponsible, that Ukraine is, kind of blackmailing everyone. That we heard things along these lines in the early 1990s, when Ukraine inherited an arsenal of strategic missiles from the Soviet Union. So when the Soviet Union fell apart, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine suddenly found themselves as major nuclear powers because of the stationing of nuclear missiles on their territories when they were parts of the administrative, republics of the Soviet Union. And of the early 1990s was focused on removing those weapons. I wouldn't say repatriating them to Russia per se, but basically getting them dismantled, and a lot of them were taken to Russia to get them dismantled. And of course, that's how Ukraine got guarantees of its territorial integrity through this supposed Budapest memorandum that was meant to ensure this with the UK, US, and Russia. But that obviously didn't hold too much water over time. So that pressure's already, been there on Ukraine and on Kazakhstan and Belarus in the past, and there was a lot of really nasty, menacing talk about Ukraine in that early period, in the early 1990s, coming out of Moscow and elsewhere, which is similar. It's almost like Putin picked up the old playbook there. But what he wants to do again is to change the discussion, to basically get us to negotiate away Ukraine and its sovereignty, territorial integrity, over not just NATO and guarantees and assurances of NATO, but also now over the threat of nuclear war, which is also intertwined, of course, because NATO is a nuclear alliance as a result of US missiles, and also, in theory, because of the French and UK nuclear capacity as well. So Putin has taken a leaf also out of earlier playbooks. They've already talked about a revival of the Cuban Missile Crisis, what they call the Caribbean Crisis, with loose talk from various actors in the Russian firmament of going to consider missile placements in Cuba or Venezuela. I mean, nothing much has come of that, since, again, more talk about this, but more meaningfully, talking about something that looks more akin to the Euro missile crisis of the 1980s, which is when I started to study Russia, and Andrew, you'll remember it, really well as well, of when there was the real threat of nuclear Armageddon in Europe because of sort of brinksmanship over the placements of SS-20 and Pershing missiles in Europe. And Putin has invoked the memories of that period. He's talking about Iskanders, not just in Kaliningrad, but potentially also in Belarus. Iskanders are nuclear-capable cruise missiles. There's been the firing, we're pretty sure of one of these missiles, not nuclear, just but conventional, either from Kaliningrad or Belarus into Kiev, demonstration effect, because he wants everyone to be rushing to the table, to basically starting to negotiate at the threat of, impending, nuclear exchange. And again, the very talk that he would be kind of considering about how to do a demonstration effect is part of that as well. But the thing is, we have to take it seriously, because all of these discussions that people are having out there, which again, I think they need to tamp down, the Lindsey Grahams and others of the world, talking about, regime change, taking him out, the full-on talk about economic war with Russia. Russia doesn't have a lot of responses to that, the full-scale economic war. This has gone much beyond what anyone would have envisaged in terms of sanctions and people sanctioning themselves, taking themselves out of, the Russian market. We've talked about this for years, about that would really have a big impact. And yes, we can see that it does. But the complete crushing and destruction of the current Russian economy, the economy won't be completely destroyed, but of course it's going to be, the ruble has fallen, it keeps on falling. There's a floor to falling because of still Russian oil and gas exports, but, now there's demands to cut off those. And, overnight, Russia's gone from a, fairly prosperous country to one that, is going to see real, living standards and incomes just plummet. Russia had something like 18,000, per capita GDP, reasonable, middle income to, kind of more higher income country. That could be halved for the, the average Russian. There's going to be an awful lot of pain being felt, and for Putin, that's not going to be easy to turn back. So then we do end up in the, their final line of defense is always nuclear. And the way that they're deploying it verbally is very difficult in itself, and we have to tackle that. We have to talk about it. We have to get other, nuclear powers to talk to the Russians behind the scenes as well, because we will be worried about proliferation issues, and we've already had to contend with nuclear blackmail from North Korea, with worries about Iran getting a nuclear weapon and what that would do to regional security issues in the Middle East, not least the threats to Israel. So we have to get a handle on this. So the reason for talking about this is to understand why he's doing it, what the risks are, and then to get people mobilized to try to tackle this diplomatically. that we really have to be able to have a pushback against this, because basically Putin's making it very clear that the only way you get to push your weight around on the international stage is to have a nuclear weapon. So that puts, kind of the whole proliferation regime in great jeopardy as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. You also, back in the 1980s, it was something that was, when you talk about the fear and dread and anxiety, I mean, that was really something that was palpable, even tangible. And you mentioned in your memoir the TV film Threads, which I don't think many Americans have seen, but I remember they showed it for some reason a number of times when I was an undergraduate, and it really scared the bejesus out of me. I mean, it is an unlikely outcome, but it is something that I think is sobering, that, this is not something that we can kind of reverse or undo. But there's another nuclear area of insecurity as well, and that is, as you mentioned, the capturing of at least 2 nuclear power sites in Ukraine by Russia, and there doesn't seem to be, at least I'm not hearing any reports of safeguards being put in place to kind of maintain not only the operations but the safety of those sites, and to what degree is that something that we should be worried about, and to what degree, quite apart from the false narratives, false flag narratives that you pointed out, should that be a concern of ours?
Absolutely, and I think it's already been articulated very clearly in some recent press interviews with the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, in Brussels, who's maybe Geneva as well, have basically been, I've forgotten where that's located now. A SAIS student would be able to tell me. Then I suddenly thought in my brain, oh gosh, I've forgotten where the IA is actually located. Oops. But anyway, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency is basically saying that he would personally like to fly, all the way out to Ukraine and basically ask for the Russian government to allow him to go and inspect the sites and to maybe take them into international supervision, because he's so concerned. So I think that kind of pretty much sums that up.
Yeah, the short answer is Vienna.
Fiona, thank you. I knew I was wrong. I said Brussels. I said no, wrong. Brain's going, no, you're wrong. Vienna.
It's been a long day. I have one more kind of Ukraine question before we move to China. And I'm going to fold a question that somebody asked here into mine. And this, I want to start with his articulation, and then if I can find it. Here we go. Okay. So why did Putin move now? Why not during the last administration? And let me expand on that question if I could. So the way the Biden administration has handled the threat to or invasion of Ukraine is a matter of record. Former President Trump has advanced a narrative that something like that would have never happened on his watch. So I have 2 distinct questions to add to that. First, would it or could it have? Second, but more importantly, from a process point of view, how would or could he have prepared for it and responded to it based on how the relevant executive branch departments, as well as the NSC, operated under his watch?
Well, so many different ways I could go on this one. But look, in part, Putin might not have been ready to go just then, right? Because he's been building up all of the troops. He's been sort of assessing the landscape. And this was a particularly propitious period. It's not always everything about the United States. We like to think it is, but that also, just the way we're framing this, suggests that everything is about us at all times. And there have been many points where we've understood that Ukraine was much more important than any kind of interactions with the US. There was one, for example, when the Russians really wanted to have an arms control negotiation with Trump. They wanted to know what would happen when the US pulled out of INF, what would come next, and they wanted to extend New START. And we were supposed to be having a major discussion with them had been planned for ages, because, obviously, as people can imagine, the Helsinki debacle threw that one off. We were going to have a discussion with them in Paris, but it didn't happen there for a variety of other, kind of interesting reasons that sometime, historians would be poring over all of these, what if, kind of moments. And it was supposed to be in Argentina. And then the Russians seized the Ukrainian naval vessel with all of their sailors in the Kerch Strait, and they wouldn't release them. And President Trump asked for them to be released, and as a condition of meeting, and the Russians told us to take a hike, showing that Ukraine, and showing Ukraine, who was the boss, was far more important than having what we thought was a pretty essential set of meetings on nuclear arms control that had been set up for months. And this was, of course, on the run-up to the election in Ukraine, where President Poroshenko was, going to be competing with, as it turns out now, the new President Zelensky, and the Russians wanted to show, kind of the Ukrainians that they didn't really have much agency, and they kept on hold of the Ukrainian ship, and it was all about teaching them a lesson. So Ukraine was always in their crosshairs. Now, President Trump also held up military aid to Ukraine, not because he was worried about provoking Russia or thinking about helping prepare Ukraine to defend itself against Russia, but because he wanted President Zelensky to do him a personal favor. I would just recommend everybody go back and read all the transcripts from the impeachment trial, and as I participated in all of that and saw the run-up to it, let's just say that idea of preparing Ukraine to defend itself was out the window when it came to, basically President Trump trying to prepare himself for staying in power, beyond 2020. And I think that Putin and everybody were watching that, right? It took Putin a rather long time to acknowledge himself that Biden had been elected president, in terms of the formal recognition and congratulations that later came in a telegram, because he's waiting to see what would happen with all of this aftermath of January 6th. Was Trump going to manage to stay himself in power? And then he would have, taken it from there. I mean, other things that were happening under Trump was blowing up NATO. So, it may not have been necessary from Putin's point of view to actually do a lot, like a full-on invasion, because NATO might have been crumbling and on its, kind of last legs. I mean, President Trump is saying, yes, they got the 2%, but look, it's the invasion of Ukraine that's got Germany to shift its entire military bases, and talk not about just about 2%, but putting it in its constitution. And in fact, Germany was resisting the entire time under President Trump any movement in that direction, because they were so angry with him, rather than thinking about the Russian threat, because of just the whole way that Trump was interacting with Germany. And Putin was watching all of that as well. He was watching all of that disarray, all of the tensions within NATO, and assuming that maybe, kind of NATO would be crumbling, and, maybe there might be less need for a full-on invasion to get what he wanted in Ukraine. And look, it also seems that what Putin thought he was going to get this time around as well was a quick move in, as it was in Georgia, with minimal destruction of cities, minimal casualties, in, out, and, kind of already in control of Ukraine. And under President Trump, who had already said that, well, isn't Crimea part of Russia because they speak Russian, and was making it very clear that Ukraine wasn't particularly important, to him as an issue, that, Putin would probably have thought he could have got away with it in a very different way. Now, the way that President Trump thought about Ukraine as well is that, again, Russian-speaking, part of Russia, this is all just about Russia and Ukraine, and at one point he offered to mediate between them as well. So that's also kind of completely misunderstanding, what the actual situation is there. Because what we're seeing in the case of Ukraine here, and I just want to make this very clear, is a post-colonial, post-imperial grab of territory by, the former imperial state. Again, analogies, we go back to that again, historical ones, 1812, with the Great Britain and the United States after, analogous kind of period of independence, would be as if the United Kingdom decided to invade Ireland now and take it back, on the premise that Ireland and Northern Ireland, the troubles have broken out again, and we've now got all of these debates about border, better to just take the whole of Ireland back again. You can play out a preposterous but nonetheless not entirely implausible scenario there, or of any other imperial country, Hungary has at times had eyes on, all of the territories that have, irredentist claims on parts of Romania and even, Ukraine and elsewhere was Ukrainian speakers, for example. So Hungary invading its neighbours, for example, to take back Hungarian speakers. I mean, we've really got a major problem here. It's a massive threat to the whole international order. And I think Putin was trying to prepare it very carefully. He had lots of different contingencies. He wanted to, make sure that NATO wasn't going to be expansion and an issue in Ukraine, but he also wanted to get a complete grip on Ukraine, and he would have had different ways of doing it. Unfortunately, he made the decision that a full-on invasion was necessary for him. And I've always very sadly thought if it was necessary, he would do it. I was kind of hoping he wouldn't, of course. I'm shocked that he has actually done it, but I'm not surprised. And again, if we go back on these whole counterfactuals, I mean, they're kind of a bit beside the point because of who we are now, right? But I think Putin was carefully preparing and he was carefully judging the situation. And again, remember, he annexed Crimea already in 2014. And there might have been a somewhat pregnant pause for 7 years, but he was trying to figure out, what else he could do and how he needed to do it and who he was going to be contending with, what the situation looked like. You have changes over in Germany, you have a weak NATO, you have a very weak European Union, you have the UK out. He would have thought everyone was fighting against each other, and our weakness here in the United States, the fact that we're even having these debates, because we're so massively polarized, we're so partisan. He's probably shocked that, we can even have, members of the two parties on the same page about his intervention here. So again, if Putin had decided he wanted to move earlier, he would have probably done it in a different way based on what he saw as the sort of correlation of forces that he had to contend with.
Just as a follow-up then, do you think that's why the Russian forces seem to have been not as well prepared as one would have expected? I mean, just the sense that, when you've got asymmetrical warfare like this, you would think the shock and awe period of the first 48 hours, that would be the easy part. And the difficulty would be the occupation and the street warfare that would occur if things didn't go according to plan, which is where we see ourselves now. I mean, it just seems to me to be not simply an error of just an egregious, probably the most egregious error of judgment, because everything hinged on this one act, and it seems to have been not as well prepared as one would expect it to have to be.
Well, it also appears, and I've been trying to read as much as I can about this and talk to other people, that Putin planned this in a very small group of military experts, and you've got to wonder about what information did they have really about circumstances on the ground in Ukraine. I was reading an article by one Russian commentator who said maybe Putin really did genuinely believe that Zelensky, took cocaine and was drug-addled, because of the bizarre commentary he's talking about, liberating Ukraine from its drug-addled, neo-fascist, Nazi leadership. And of course, I mean, he clearly isn't a Nazi. I mean, he's, a Jewish Russian-speaking Ukrainian who had family who, died in Babin Yar and fought against Nazi Germany during World War II. Putin's also obsessed by this idea of Ukrainian nationalism, and Stepan Bandera, the Ukrainian nationalist who collaborated with the Nazis during World War II and operated out of Poland, and all of these sort of similar new neo-Nazi Ukrainian nationalist brigades that appeared, like the Azov Brigade and others. But I mean, every single country in Europe, including Russia, has their own right-wing neo-fascist groups at this particular moment. But Putin's whole reading of wartime World War II history, he's always referring to Stepan Bandera, the Ukrainian nationalist insurgent during World War II that rumor had it that the Soviets assassinated later in the 1950s. He's kind of got his own views of what's happening inside of Ukraine. And if that's the views of the group around him, they clearly didn't know what they were dealing with. And again, like you're saying, the sort of shock and awe, that's why I was talking about the analogies with Chechnya when Pavel Grachov said, I'll be in and out in 24 hours, you won't even know I was there. I mean, they really did think this. And I mean, this is just what is just so horrifying about the whole thing, which is they obviously they thought through different aspects of this, but it wasn't a large group. It seems to be that the majority of the technocrats in the government are in just total shock about it, as well as being surprised that they had no inkling this was going to happen. That a lot of people in the Duma thought that they were going to be recognizing the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk, and then probably a military operation, this special military operation to take control of those the rest of the administrative borders that were under Ukrainian hands rather than under the rebel forces. And perhaps ensuring kind of some kinds of transportation corridors to Crimea, etc., etc. They had no idea. In fact, they completely rebuffed that intelligence. And that gets back to something you asked before about preparation. At one point about we could be prepared. If people don't believe the warnings and don't believe that something like that can happen, it's very difficult to prepare people. Because, there are many, many people in the US intelligence community who knew that Putin was so fixated on NATO and was always warning about this. And, kind of the idea, though, that he would do something so drastic to head that off was always being discounted. I mean, we warned about that when I was the National Intelligence Officer in 2008, and it happened in Georgia, but then people assumed that it was because of Mikhail Saakashvili and, kind of the antipathy Putin had towards him, and other people didn't like him either, so that was kind of discounted. And so preparation is only really necessary when people fully process the warnings and fully understand what could have happened. Could we have prepared the Ukrainian military to head this off? Well, then the Russians would have found other ways, or tried to kind of maybe there'd be more aviation, or other massive cyber attacks, things that we were kind of anticipating. We would have had to be all sort of full spectrum awareness and constantly figuring this out. We'd have had to have others to believe us as well, and to be preparing alongside. I mean, look, the French and Germans were poo-pooing, not the Germans entirely, but the French absolutely were just, no, this is not going to happen, as most people in Russia were, and an awful lot of people, here were as well. So, I mean, it makes it very difficult to prepare adequately and to, get all of your things in order if people don't want to sort of believe the warnings.
Which I guess brings us to China. One of the first questions that we have here is, do you think that China was deliberately misled by Russia on Russia's true ambitions in Ukraine? There's this New York Times, March 2nd New York Times article where, according to internal intelligence, there was a conversation during the Xi-Putin summit where where China asked if Russia could please put off the invasion until after the closing ceremonies. I mean, without speculating on the veracity of that, because that's just something unless you do know the answer. To what degree does, my first response was kind of channeling my China scholar hat, was that this is a case of buyer's remorse, and a notion, this idea of, you want to maybe do a little bit more due diligence on your ally, when you pretty much stick your neck out, in the sense that, to the degree that China has, culminating in the the February summit and the the document that emanated from it. So, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I'd be interested to, as this is a conversation as well, Andrew, I'm going to put you on the spot as well on, some of this too, because, I wonder, a lot about, obviously, the people asking the questions as well about how did that whole conversation take place between Xi and Putin. I spend a lot of time often in these cases wondering about what gets lost in translation. I mean, you're a Mandarin speaker, I'm absolutely not, but I am a Russian speaker. And there's all kinds of nuances in the Russian language that, you can't translate in English. And, an interpreter is there to facilitate the conversation, but they're not always kind of being able to explain the context, right? So does Putin fully understand, the context of things that are said by Xi, and should Xi fully understand the context of things that are said by Putin? So the nuances, the, kind of the double meanings, in the language. And do the interpreters afterwards, have the temerity to actually say, hey, we might want to, kind of think about this one. How many people in the room, beyond the interpreters, were there? were any of those, either Mandarin or Russian speakers on either side? Because I have been in meetings, for example, where I've had the interpreter come up and say, look, I just think that all this stuff was lost in translation, that we need to, kind of go back and, figure out and just flag that this was missing, because the interpreter on the other side didn't interpret it properly, or I could tell that they didn't kind of understand what was saying, and there was a bigger, kind of backstory to this. So is it that she might have come away, like it seems that some of the members of the Russian parliament did, thinking that Putin was going to go into Donbass, to Donetsk and Luhansk, get recognition of this, and not go full force invasion? And, then is it also the case, of course, and this is, where I would have a question for you as well, that, some of this could really play to China's advantage. What struck me the most was this February 4th statement. It's the first time that China actually becomes an acknowledged security player in Europe. It's been a major political player, an economic player, well, more political economic, or economic more so than political perhaps, with a strong emphasis, though we know that it uses political leverage as well, as we've seen in Australia and elsewhere. But on the political side, China had set up that 17+1 arrangement to deal with countries of Eastern Europe, although I think Lithuania pulled out of that. Yet it's been a major sort of player in the context of creating these bilateral relationships with the UK. It's always been very kind of keen on being an economic player and being counted in other ways in Europe. But it's never really been such an element in security in Europe. And then suddenly it's China and Xi are making comments about NATO enlargement. And NATO is something that it doesn't like. Admittedly, France and the UK, who are both NATO members, along with the United States and Canada, are players in the Asia Pacific. And the AUKUS, Australia, UK, United States submarine deal, the Chinese didn't like, but it wasn't really part of NATO. So this is very interesting to me. And then, saying that there's no limits to the relationship, other kind of commentary of standing and getting Russia's back, allowing Russia essentially to feel pretty confident and safe on its eastern flanks. We can move all of the men and equipment from the Russian Far East over to Belarus and then into Ukraine. I mean, that's pretty astounding, development from the past. And I will be the first to admit I was wrong, in thinking about how far the Russian-Chinese relationship could go, way back when it looked more like it was a sort of an alliance of convenience, and that there were too many tensions. Now, those tensions are still there. But, one thing is, from China's point of view, is Russia looks increasingly like a dependent state rather than an independent player. And, does, Russia suddenly become a vassal state of China? Because, if we do end up with cutting off energy, for example, I mean, I was talking to someone from a major energy company earlier in the week who said, it's not that difficult, with all the pipelines that are being constructed right now across Siberia, for China to then make new deals on China's terms, for cheaper, Russian oil and gas, that then suddenly, Russia's China's gas station. And that might play to its advantage. But then the question is, does there end up being other pressure from other countries who kind of are wondering why it is that the country, China, that suffered so much in World War II and at previous times, the rape of Nanjing and all of these other atrocities that were carried out against China during World War II and previous, carving up of China, really want to be associated with the dismemberment of Ukraine, where it was one of the largest investors. But, then how does China's position affect Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, other countries that might have been sitting on the fence, India that has that hot conflict with China in the Himalayas? I mean, I can't answer those questions, but the things that I think are extremely important right now, because also many of us think that Xi is one of the few leaders who could actually say something to Putin, kind of in a way of, look, maybe we need to find a way out of this war right now, humanitarian or whatever else, or, kind of, and actually China could then play, I mean, probably a pretty advantageous role in this for itself later, of kind of, stepping in a European arena, which, for again, first time in history.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, there's, on that last point, my sense is that, had China been less bold in February, it could have been more bold now. And that's, I think that's a missed opportunity. but getting back to the the question of things being lost in translation, this I was not in the room, but I can respond in a on the one hand, on the other hand kind of thing. So on the one hand, it does seem that this is a relationship between the individuals of Xi and Putin that is quite personal and quite personalized. And even though and I think in the case of Russia is far more a personalized top-down authority structure than what you have in China, regardless of what what we the image that China is projecting right now. So on the one hand, I could see some sort of kind of indirect kind of personal assurances that might have been kind of extended or stretched kind of beyond their initial meaning. But on the other, there's when you get to questions like indivisible security, which is a big issue right now, and you see it in the Chinese press. It is something that is essentially something that's easily manipulated or consciously or unconsciously, in good faith or in bad faith, misinterpreted, deliberately or otherwise. That's something that may well have led to this a seeming green light when it was in fact yellow. In addition to the other things that you were talking about regionally in China, I mean, the other thing too is one of the assumptions that we've had for a long time right now has been that China has really upgraded its military to the degree where it is unrecognizable from what it had been 40 years ago, and that while a military action to secure Taiwan into the People's Republic would be not as, would not be the impossible task that it was in the 1990s. I think what we're seeing here may cause military leaders in China to reflect on the kind of the inevitability or the costs involved. I think that one of the things that all of this has awakened was this notion of NATO and Western alliances being asleep at the wheel, and crumbling, and what this has done, at least in the very short term, has put a lie to all of that. I guess another question that, and then the other thing that you pointed out is that ironically, right around the time of the 50th anniversary of U.S.-China rapprochement, what you have is, I think the point that you make, which I'd love for you to expand upon, is that China was the weak player that sought kind of U.S. security guarantees against the then Soviet Union. Now it seems that China is the stronger power, that Russia is seeking security guarantees from vis-a-vis the West. Can you expand on your thoughts on that particular part of the puzzle?
Yeah, I mean, this is the interesting point, right? The inflection point. I mean, Russia clearly has seen China over the last several years, particularly since the annexation of Crimea, as being the major pole to gravitate towards. But obviously on the premise that Russia itself has something to offer, that Russia is a major player, and Putin and others always talking about there being three major global players. China, Russia, then the United States. But as you're pointing out, thinking that maybe the US was in massive terminal decline, the West was asleep at the wheel, the idea that they'd kind of bought us all out. And I think Russia really kind of feeling that this relationship with China was going to be very propitious and a positive one, helping to kind of pull along the Russian economy, but also providing Russia with degrees of security. And obviously it was very important for Putin to get from Xi backing for this escapade, because it enabled him to kind of put, kind of a full focus on the Western Front. But now, given this massive reaction, not just the failings of the military operation, and I mean, obviously we all assume that if you put everything that they've got at it, they could totally flatten Ukraine, and basically leave the kind of sort of scorched earth victory, the Pyrrhic victory that Assad had in Syria, or that we've seen over the whole swathe of history, leaving Ukraine ungovernable and livable, and kind of a massive reverberations from all of that. But the response that they've got from of not just the West, but much larger response. I mean, the UN General Assembly, etc., has clearly been and will be a shock, literally, to the economic and political system in Russia, and that now suddenly leaves Russia vulnerable vis-a-vis China. Even if some of the older tensions in Central Asia and Arctic and historical problems over the borders, don't kind of play out as some of us might have assumed that they would. That dependency on China is going to be extraordinarily uncomfortable for Russia. And Russia was, of course, one of the imperial powers, colonial powers back in the day that predated upon China. So there's, kind of still that sort of feeling of probably, quiet satisfaction of a kind of, low-grade vengeance that maybe, kind of sort of the revenge of history. The way that India feels, kind of in Britain, where it's taken over most of the manufacturing, it's completely understandable, over time, given, the role of the British in India, for example. So this could be a very uncomfortable period ahead for Russia, where, having cut off everywhere back to the West, it finds itself not in a more strategic position with the strategic autonomy that it thought it had, but in a really dependent position with China able to call the shots more. And the rest of us also looking, to China in the hope that we might be able to have Xi do a bit of a reversal for whatever the heck conversation that they had around the margins of Beijing, to basically say, look, this has gone far enough.
I mean, it's a difficult time also because of the 20th Party Congress in the fall.
Right.
She could be seen as being too beholden to external events that, somehow rattle him domestically. I think that another point that you made about this is pure speculation on my part, but it seems to me that it was probably a tremendous relief for China to see Russian forces mobilized away from their common border in Siberia towards the Western theater. And that may well have been part of the talks without necessarily the actual outcome being fully articulated. And of course, Russia was one of the imperialist powers, but it was Russia's defeat by Japan that really was the final straw in terms of China kind of realizing that it was potentially going to be not be able to survive the imperialist onslaught at the time. And so in a sense, this is China coming back full circle. In a sense, where a Western power, a great Western power, is now potentially quite vulnerable to Beijing's leverage. I wanted to ask kind of a larger question, particularly from the Russian perspective, about how natural is the relationship between Russia and China? I mean, in terms of affinities, in terms of, because beyond the Sino-Soviet alliance, such as it was, what are there major historical forces there that somehow bound the two together, or is this a more of a kind of a transactional geopolitical relationship?
I think it's more transaction and geopolitical, but I think certain affinities have built up over as you've already pointed out over the past 10 plus years, because that personal relationship between Xi and Putin, and that there's been so many meetings between them, and obviously between their entourages, that's kind of become kind of more of a thickness in that relationship. There has been a lot of trade. There's been Chinese citizens moving in to the Russian Far East, and setting up various enterprises, the leasing of some agricultural land, for example. There bit of, kind of cross-border intermarriage. There's, you've had historically Russians in Harbin and elsewhere after the collapse of the Russian Empire. There were kind of Russian settlements of white Russians who were sort of fleeing the communists, initially living in China. The history isn't all dark, but then there is all the tensions in places like Central Asia and along the Amur River, on the old borderlands, and then, as you've pointed out, that history of the struggle between the Russian Empire and Japan for Manchuria and the kind of the lands of the Korean Peninsula, and the consequences that led to in China itself of dismemberment, and obviously some pretty horrible periods of occupation by Japan, and then during World War II. And then, we all were quite familiar with the complexities of the Sino-Soviet relationship and the different ways that played out. I think that, again, we've often discounted, myself included, the ways that, the United States pushes countries together and sort of shapes the environment, and the way that, Russia and China have been so implacably opposed to various things that the United States has done, that it really has pulled them, closer together. And that, again, we can't discount this last 10, 12 years, all of which has been under Putin, by the way, and then Xi and his predecessors, of which those relationships have come much closer, and there have been all kinds of declarations of friendship. But again, that was all premised on the fact that Russia was a strong independent player, and that Russia had all this leverage in Europe and elsewhere. And now, I don't know, I think we're going to have to watch this. Like I was saying before, a more dependent, weaker Russia becomes something very different. That's not the Russia that China's been dealing with, for the last, 20 odd years that Putin turned the place around, and, looked like Russia at one point was on track to become one of the world's top 5 economies. I mean, okay, China far surpassed that after the Great Recession, the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. China's rise has been really rapid, but Russia has also been pulled along by that rise of all the massive appetite for commodities and oil and gas and other raw materials. And this is now just a dramatic shift. But as you said, it also, I mean, we don't know yet whether it's going to be a complete cautionary tale, right? Because we don't know how this all plays out still. But China, I'm sure, will be watching very closely to see what happens to the Russian economy. And then will there be an effort for China to help try to sort of bail Russia out and find different ways of, kind of avoiding sanctions and payments? How China will react now is going to be very instructive as well. Will they double down? And the propaganda inside of China seems all more favorable towards Russia. But again, we're still early days. I mean, I'd be curious to see what you think about how China will look at this as well.
I'm thinking of this as the bookend, or at least up until the eve of the invasion as being a bookend, with the other end being the fall of communism. I've been recently in my classes, we've been spending more time than I have in the past, just because we have more and more students who weren't alive or conscious at the time, just on the impact of the years between 1989 and 1991 and the stories that various countries drew from them. And for China, 1989 was, as you say, a cautionary tale, and just in case China's leaders weren't sure whether or not they did the right thing by suppressing the democracy movement in Beijing and elsewhere, came when the Ceausescus were executed, and then it was pretty clear that, had we not done this, there by the grace of God go we. And so for a long time, Russia was seen very much as, or the Soviet Union under Gorbachev was seen very much as, something to be not only avoided, but scorned and belittled. And the more China was able to do that, the more also it was isolated, at least on that front, where relations with the West to go south, or more south than they already were. And I think you're right that China saw in Putin, a rise of Russia, not a communist Russia, because you point out that in certain ways Putin is not at all
No.
a Marxist in terms of how he looks at markets, how he looks at religion, et cetera, but as another strong kind of non-Western power. I mean, the thing, one of the reasons why China, one of the things that made Marxism so irresistible to Chinese intellectuals in the 19 teens and 20s was that it was Western and anti-West. And in a sense, what we're seeing now is this notion of, or what we had seen up until this point, was this idea that, well, we're more comfortable in Beijing cozying up to, a fellow traveler in Moscow. This potentially upends all of that. I wanted to just one other question that I had for what does this do in terms of Russia's relations in the East Asian, Northeast Asian, and possibly even Indo-Pacific sphere? What does this? What might some of the ripple effects of all of this be from your point of view?
Well, I think we've already seen, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, take some pretty dramatic action like us, because they're all looking at the prospects for something similar happening to them. Certainly South Korea and Japan feel under incredible threat as a result of this, because Russia has set a precedent for a larger country bristling with nuclear weapons to take territory or to impose itself on them for demands. Let's think China. So they really need to push back. And also, I mean, particularly from Japan, they have been extraordinarily disillusioned and dissatisfied, even though I think the expectations of something happening were only really limited to previous Prime Minister Abe, about the Russia's unwillingness to really make any moves on the northern territories of the Kuril Island dispute, despite all kinds of promises of some kind of political breakthrough. That was really not on the cards, and the Russians make it more clear that they want to beef up their military and security presence in the Northeast Asia Pacific, and kind of very adamant on wanting to become a major player there. And they've all watched Japan and South Korea, also investors in Ukraine and elsewhere, and obviously in Europe too, and watching with horror how this is unfolding. Same with Australia, but India is obviously quite a different case. India's relations with all three countries of Russia, China, and the United States are complex. Long-standing friendship with Russia. A lot of anxiety and stress in their relationship with China. Wanting to buy S-400s, which the Chinese got S-400s as well, as kind of part of the defense, not just against Pakistan, but also against China. Hot conflict in the Himalayas with China over territorial disputes. Feeling very discomforted by Pakistan's closeness with all three of its other important interlocutors. China brokering a different relationship with Pakistan with Russia, because you had Imran Khan going to Russia just before the invasion. Pakistan's relationship with the United States is sour, but one of the reasons that India moved closer to Russia was because Pakistan and the United States had kind of pulled closer together at different junctures. For India, this is a nightmare, what's happening, and they're just basically trying to figure out what they can do. So they've been very much sort of sitting on the fence and trying to kind of tack this way and that way, trying to make sure that they got all of the Indian students, huge numbers of them, out of Kharkiv and Kiev. I mean, this was one of the reasons of the old Soviet-Indian friendship, was to get the training for a lot of Indian students, engineers and doctors in Soviet universities that was heavily subsidized or free. And Ukraine maintained that. Students from all the way around the world of the so-called global south studying there. Modi obviously having an important personal relationship with Putin as well. So, and then we've got, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, all watching this very closely. Wherever there's a sort of a tense relationship with the United States, there might have been a closer relationship with Russia, and obviously China looming there. And I'm sure that they're all just watching to see how this is going to play out. And, the kind of question there is, what messages they're taking away from it? Because, and again, we're not on the end game here. We've got to, figure out, where this all goes here. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more recalculation and a lot more reorientation of global affairs here as countries try to sort of figure out where this ends up. Does Russia then, as we said, become a kind of a vassal state or the gas station for China, now having no other option but, kind of being with China, playing, a very different role in the Asia-Pacific region than clearly it intended? Does that then mean that, other countries are more inclined to, because of proximity, to pay more attention to China and, try to kind of minimize their response to this? I think the United Nations is going to be a very important forum for how all of this plays out, for example, because does Ukraine then get taken on as a kind of an international cause célèbre for all the countries that have had their independence and territorial integrity basically infringed upon? But of course, we've got so many other countries that are out there where there are dreadful things happening, like Yemen, Syria, Libya, and we haven't exactly tackled those. So will there be then more of a feeling, well, this is just because the Europeans are reacting to this because it's Ukraine, it's one of them, this doesn't really kind of affect us, we need to kind of get on with our own affairs and actually pay less attention to Europe? All these things are possible. There's all kinds of different ways in which this can play out. And I think we have to just be very attentive, which gets back to where we started, which is this is why we need, students studying international affairs. And I do think now that Europe and Asia have been brought together. And instead of looking at them separately, we need to get, a bit more of this, cross-comparative perspective here. I mean, I wish I knew a lot more about China and Asia. And, I've spent quite a lot of time looking at Japanese, US-Russian, relations, triangular relations. And I just, would really commend to everybody to take as many courses as they can when they have that opportunity to really look at all of these intersections and to understand, where we've been and where we might be heading. This is one of those enormously pivotal moments. The Berlin Wall came down, and now we've moved into this, invasion of Ukraine with a lot of things intervening. But there's a kind of a bookend to this kind of period as well.
If you've lived long enough, you get a sense of what a pivotal event feels like when it actually happens. And, I do get that sense that we are living in one such moment. We're almost out of time. I'm just going to throw one complete softball question to you, which is, what question have I not raised, or have we not raised, that you wished we did or would have, and what would the answer to that be?
Well, look, I think there's really sort of the issue about what we can all do about this beyond just, studying and, trying to understand and explain it. I mean, I think that this war in Ukraine is brought to a halt only when there is just the sort of the force of people power brought to its full extent. We can all go out there and try to do something. We also have to remember that ordinary Russian students, your classmates, your friends didn't cause this. This was very much a decision made by a tiny clique of people. And the repression inside of Russia is pretty phenomenal, and it's going to increase, and it's going to be very difficult, to kind of figure out inside of Russia what's going on. And we have to find a way of bringing kind of Russians and Russia back, into the broader international space and international economy again. So we have to kind of bear in mind that whatever we're doing has to be temporary. We have to have a way back. Well, there's not going to be a way back. It is a different way forward than what is, kind of the track that we're on now, with sort of closing down and cutting off. And I think that as individuals and then as kind of groups and networks, we all have a role that we can play here. You have all kinds of students from Russia, Ukraine, and elsewhere in your student body. You've got networks of relationships with student groups, other universities. sister institutions in Russia and elsewhere. I think we've all got to kind of figure out ways in which we kind of get out the word about what's happening here, how we have to stop this war, and basically help Ukrainians who are fleeing this and help them to be able to go back home again and build the country up again. And so I would just sort of say we've all got some agency here, and they're all things that all of us as individuals can do as well. Not just staying informed and being able to explain things, but there's always forms of direct action that you can take. Networks that you can build upon to help people, for example.
Well, I can't think of a better note on which to end this. Dr. Fiona Hill, thank you so much for taking the time. I think you've done an invaluable service to everybody here, and please keep on doing what you're doing and inspiring us to do the same.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Andrew. And I enjoyed the conversation. I took lots of notes on your China points there to help to enlighten myself moving forward. So I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to everyone and just, let's see what we can do in this dark and difficult time.
Fair enough. Thanks so much. Be well and talk soon.
Likewise. Every best wish, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.